so we're going to be studying tonight. We're going to be working through 1 Samuel 17 together. So you guys can go ahead and turn there in your Bibles. We're doing the David and Goliath passage. I want to do something that y'all are familiar with, but also something that we could have some fun with and be able to find some things. So let me do a quick review over what we look for in narrative. So we're asking the question, what? And with narrative, we're specifically asking the question, what happened? Before we can understand anything about narrative, understand how we apply a narrative to our lives, before we can use it to impact our walk with God, we just have to understand what happened. And so we're asking the questions of characters. We're looking for the main character. I'm going to circle back to that in a second to help find that out easier. We are looking for setting. We're looking for plot line. We're looking for background. And then we're looking for scenes. And so with main character, another way to phrase this is, have you guys seen the Andy Griffith Show? Great show. All right. So if you watch season 1, you'll see that Andy Taylor is just as goofy as the rest of the people. Midway through the first season, he changes. There's an interview of him actually talking about this. And he said he realized something as he was playing the character. He went, I'm the straight man. That's what he said. I'm the straight man, which is he's the guy that's reacting to everything that happens around him. And so you watch any episode of the Andy Griffith Show, it doesn't matter if something's going on with Barney, with Aunt Bee, with Opie, anything like that, it all comes back to how does this revolve around Andy Taylor. The main character of a story is the straight man. They're the ones who, everything that happens, 1 Samuel 17. He's the main character is the one that they're the main driver of the story, and everything else that happens comes back to them. And everything reflects into that. And so that's what we're looking for. If you're trying to figure out who's the main character in the story, just take a moment and think, okay, who's the main driver of this story, and what they do and what happens around them comes back to them. So that's there. Something with scenes, I'll just want to reiterate that we talked about last week. When we're looking for scenes, this isn't massive shifts. That's more of the concept of an act. That's where a whole passage has changed. Scenes are short divides in the text that transition us into moving the story along. So I described it last week of we're thinking of a TV show episode. The episode is the pericope, it's the biblical text that we're handling, the whole story that we're looking at. And the scene change happens when character A is talking to character B, story ends, character A walks into the kitchen and sees character C and starts a conversation. A scene has changed. And so those are the kinds of things that we're going to be looking for in the text. I also mentioned one other thing. You cannot understand the story until you've read the whole story. So when we're studying something like Ephesians, we walk through verse by verse, and we can take thought by thought there. When we're taking a story, when we're really breaking it down, we need to read the whole story, find out some of these main observations, and then go back through the story again. And our goal is, does anyone remember last week what I said the goal of at the end of a story of being able to answer what you should be able to do?
Give a retelling.
Give a retelling. We're looking to retell the story. And when you can retell the story in your own words, and that can be with a lot of words, that can be with a few sentences. Depending on the text is what's going to be how long it is, but you're just looking to be able to just retell the story. You don't need to be able to say, this is what worked to learn from it. We'll talk about how we get to that later. But for now, we're just trying to get to, we want to be able to retell the story. So, we're going to read through 1 Samuel 17, and I need 6 volunteers to read. So, who's going to put a hand up first? Anthony, can you read 1 to 10? All right. Who wants to read second? Jennifer, 11 to 20. Who's next? Miss Betty, 21 to 30. Miss Patty, 31 to 40. Saw your hand, Ashley. 41 to 50, and one more person. Miss Jean, 51 to 58. So, Anthony, you can go ahead and start us.
You use the New King James Version, right?
Yes, we can use whatever version you have in front of you, though. If you are reading something different, tell people the translation you're reading before you start reading.
I'm gonna read from the New King James Version. Okay. And in verse 1 it says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Sokoa, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Sokoa and Zekah and Ephes."
Just say hard word.
Okay, hard word. "And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like the weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and his shield bearer went before him." Verse 8 says, "Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel, and said to them, Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together."
When Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of a Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years, in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of the 3 sons who went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn. Next to him was Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Then Jesse said to his son David, "Now take for your brothers a bit of dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them." Now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle.
Go ahead, verse 21. Everybody.
For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion and the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philippines, and spake according to the same words, and David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have ye seen this man that is come up surely to defy Israel? Is he come up? And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. And David said, What have I done now? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him toward another, and spake after the same manner. And the people answered him again, after the former manner.
And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with the Philistines. And Saul said to David, Thou art not able to go against the Philistines to fight with him, for thou art but a young youth, and he is man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came lions and bears, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of the mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said, Moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paws of the lion and out of the paws of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hands of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, Go, and the Lord be with thee. And Saul armed David with his armor, and he put a helmet of brass upon his head, and also he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proven it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proven them. And David put them off. And he took his staff in his hands, and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and he put them in his shepherd's bag, which he had, even in a scrip, and his sling was in his hands, and he drew near to the Philistine.
I'm reading from the CSB version. The Philistine came closer and closer to David, with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him because he was just a youth, healthy and handsome. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come against me with sticks?" Then he cursed David by his gods. "Come here," the Philistine said to David, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. You have defied him. Today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I'll strike you down, remove your head, and give the corpse of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. He will hand you over to us." When the Philistines started forward to attack him, David ran quickly to the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in the bag, took out a stone, and slung it, and hit the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down to the ground. David defeated the Philistine with a sling and a stone. David overpowered the Philistine and killed him without having a sword.
Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines until thou come to the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Sherahim, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. And when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As thy soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell." And the king said, "Inquire thou whose son the stripling is." And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son art thou, thou young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite."
All right. Big passage, but one story. You see how to understand the story, you have to be in all 58 verses, right? All right. Let's start doing some work then. All right. Let's start with this. Shout out the characters you saw in the story.
David,
All right.
Goliath, Saul,
Abner,
Who else we see?
Jesse.
people we can't pronounce.
People can't pronounce. Let's say brothers of David.
His brother, 5 brothers,
Brothers of David. What other characters do we see? Did we see God in this story? So, I'm gonna challenge something now. Gonna help you with this. I knew someone was going to say God, so I prepared for this. You're not wrong. God's present in every story. But we can't let our spirituality of saying, well, God's in every story to affect that in the story. God is not actually a present character. He's spoken of as an external character, but he is not an active character in the story. This matters because there are times when God is an active character in the story, and those distinctions matter. And so, while it's always true that God is a part of the story, we want to be careful not to say he's a active character when he might not be. Any other characters we see? Philip. Way to go. Alright, what would be the counterpart then of the Philistines?
Israel.
Israel. That's another way to understand characters as well. It's not always individuals. Sometimes it's broad like that. You have the Philistines, you have the Israelites. And so you have that. Any other characters?
Abner,
Abner we got. I'm going to put underneath the brothers itself eldest brother because he comes back and plays an important role.
Eliab, E-L-I-A-B.
E-L-I-A-B. Alright. Any other characters we see? Alright, who do you guys think in this is the main character?
David. Or Goliath, I mean, David.
Okay. Well, we have these two. Alright, let's talk about why it's David over Goliath.
Yeah.
David would be, we would use the term protagonist. Goliath would be the antagonist. Goliath becomes the second most important person in this story, but it's all about David. So, David's our main character. All right, now let's do setting. All right, let me help you guys with something. Sometimes we're told locations that you don't necessarily need to know everything about, because sometimes we don't even know where places are. Now, if I were to look up a Bible dictionary, I'm pretty sure I could find out where Sokoa and Azekah and Ephes Damin is, but we don't know. So, when we're talking about setting, what's another way we can describe a setting besides just location? Time, or generally what's going on. So let's talk about what's generally going on in this situation.
Well, it does say in verse 2 that Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines, which occupied one hill, and the Israelites occupied another, with the valley between them.
Mm-hmm. And so that we have Israel on one mountain, Philistines on the other. The valley in between. All right.
Essentially, it's a battlefield.
Battlefield. So, sometimes in stories, we don't need to know necessarily the exact location. So, here's something that you can end up doing, and it ends up being fruitless. You can go and you can look up where the Valley of Elah is, and then you can find out where Sokoa and Azekah and all these different places are, and you ultimately get nothing out of it. Because the point of that setting was to be more visual. So, let me give an example. The Battle of Bunker Hill. All right, major battle in American history. We know about it. We don't necessarily know exactly where it's at least in our minds. Historians do, but you might not know. You can know everything about the Battle of Bunker Hill without being able to point on a map where it's at. And so here, what matters more in setting is it's a battlefield. We're on a battlefield. Now, some other setting stuff that needs to be understood, though, is the relation of Israel and the Philistines. So we have these two places. Does anyone know where the Philistines are at in relation to Israel? Here's the Mediterranean. Israel is here. The Philistines occupy different parts of land that's right along the Mediterranean Sea. So, Israel is blocked from getting to the seaport through them. The Philistines are a Phoenician people. That doesn't matter unless you're a historian person. But they are, that's part of it. That there would be major fighting because Israel is going to want to use the sea for commerce. Philistines block their way. And so there's constant tension between them. There's also constant tension because God promised Israel the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines don't want to leave. And Israel's having a hard time conquering them. And so we have that relationship there of setting. So you have in there, you have that time setting, you have the setting of conflict. So we can put it as conflict between Philistines and Israel. Is there any other setting things that you guys notice that might be helpful? Alright, let's hit the next thing. I'm gonna have to erase something eventually. Background. Shout out some things that you know about the characters you've heard. Let's go with just two. Let's start with Saul. What do you know about Saul? King. Anything else we know about Saul?
His spirit is disturbed.
Spirit is disturbed.
Yes, he's doing the job.
What else do we know about Saul? He's tall. He's a head above everyone else. What else do we know about him?
He didn't want the job.
Didn't want the job, reluctant leader. And a crappy donkey farmer. Something else we could toss in there.
He was afraid.
So, we are going to hit that in a second. Right now, for background, we're going to hit that. But keep on to that thought because that's going to be important based off of
I
this.
mean, all due respect, he's not a godly king.
Now,
See in the story.
we don't know that yet, necessarily. Maybe we do. You might be right. No, you're right. He's been rejected as king. You're right. He's been rejected as king. Alright.
If he was rejected and he didn't want it, why'd he stay there?
Guys, he didn't initially want it. He wanted to keep it, then God rejected him as king.
Oh, okay.
So, but yeah, alright. Let's take David now. What do we know about David up until this point in story? So, don't talk later. Think
Just a little shepherd. Little
Little-
shepherd boy.
little shepherd boy. Great use of terminology there. Little
Yeah, good looking, he's.
shepherd boy. What
But
else?
was he little in stature or just the youngest son?
So, from most of the things that we get from him, especially we really see it in this story of he puts on Saul's armor and he can't fit into it.
Yeah.
And so our understanding is he's at least smaller than Saul.
Well, he's
Oh.
a giant too, so that don't really take much.
That doesn't take much, but we do the picture painted of David is youngest little shepherd boy. He's out in the field.
Right.
Fine.
He also killed a lion.
Killed a lion.
And a bear.
We kind of learned that from this story, but yes.
Wasn't he after God's own heart?
That's just what I was about to say. Thank you,
After
Doctor.
God's own heart.
I'm sorry.
No, thank you.
Alright. What else has happened in David's life? Up until this point. What precedes this?
He was anointed.
He's been anointed king. Okay. Notice some background contrast between the two. There's a fuller story being told inside this story that we're going to see. Alright. So we see those things. Let me see what I've written down on this. Alright. We generally understand the plot line. Let me give that to you. We have, up until this point, Israel is always meant to have a king, but they're not meant to have a warrior king. Israel wants a king to be a warrior king. God says to them, you don't want a king, he's going to tax you more than a tithe. Which also, if you're wondering, God's view of taxes is anything over a 10% tax is wicked. That's just tossing that out there. That's just free knowledge for you. Saul, reluctant king, is anointed. Saul's anointed king because he is big. He is strong. He is powerful. And what he does is he goes and he does not do what God tells him to do. He goes out into battle, and instead of hacking Agag to pieces and destroying everything as God commanded, he kept some back. He also, I believe, to this point, has he's offered a sacrifice that he was not supposed to. And this is where God rejects him as king, and then David has been anointed king. Now, we don't actually know the size of David, but the way the story's been unfolded has been the contrast of large Benjamite King Saul, powerful, little shepherd boy that didn't even deserve to be brought up when Samuel asked, where are the sons of Jesse? Major distinction between them. So we have the youngest son. So that's the plot line coming up. Now, let's start working through. And I'm going to... Well, it's already setting. That one seems to be one that we're already... We don't need the reminder of. Alright, let's talk about scenes. Alright. You read through using verse numbers. What do you think the first scene is? I'll give you a hint. It starts in verse 1.
Gathering of armies.
So you have the gathering of armies. And from that, I would say we could include in that scene the champion of the Philistines coming out of the gathering of armies. And so, I'll help with. I would put the first scene to be between verses 1 and 10. So you have this background setting, it's building up. And so imagine the episode starts, it pans over the valley. It sees the encampment of the Israelites, and it comes to these two mountains. And on one side you have Israel, on the other side you have the Philistines, and you have this valley in between. And then the camera zooms in, and this large giant of a man comes out from the Philistines, and he challenges the Israelites to a fight. That's our first scene. The camera swings around to the other side of Israel. And we have the next scene starting in verse 11. And it starts with Saul and all Israel heard the words and were greatly afraid. Big old Saul is shaking in his boots. Can you feel it? Can you feel the story? That build up. You had it. And so you have this next scene, and then you can probably put 11 by itself as just that, kind of an offshoot of this. Verse 12, you then have this transition. What transition happens between verse 11 and verse 12? What was that?
Trying to find out who's going to fight him.
So we have, that's not what's happened between, read verse 11 and then 12. Who does the thinking that term?
David and his family.
It moves over. So we're over in the mountains, we're in the fight, and the camera moves all the way to David. And so we have the setup. So we can call this introduction of the battle. And then verse 12, we have David. Now, at what point would you put this next scene? Verse 12 of we're seeing this next scene pan out.
We're learning about his family history somewhat in this verse.
Yep, and then we see an interaction of him and Jesse. So, think of the TV show. We have it to where we've entered into the kitchen and David and Jesse start talking. And then David's gonna go out of the kitchen. What verse would you put it at of David is now leaving the kitchen? Think 20, so ending this at verse 19. And we can call this David bringing food. Now, with this, we're just in the scene chart, and really put your mind in this as you're walking through it. I don't know what's about to happen. All we just saw was this little kid being told, go get cheese sandwiches and take it to your brother who's fighting the battle. So you have that build. So then we have our next scene, verse 20. And what would you guys take the next scene to?
Verse 20.
Verse 20 is the
Getting
start.
ready for the battle? I mean,
So- So verse 20, I would take it to 27 of David's first interaction with Goliath.
Okay.
Would y'all agree with that? So you go to verse 27. You have David's interaction with Goliath. All right. Then we pick up in verse 28 and we have kind of a step off to the side. The main story's going, but then you have something different going on in the step off of this conversation of older brother to younger brother. So you have Eliab, and where would you guys put the end of that?
He was telling David what to do with his stuff.
So where would you put the end of the scene of that, of where he's doing
29.
that? 29. I think we could go into 30. 30, and really, I would even say 31. 31 ends up being a transition.
Yeah.
And Eliab versus David. Alright. Then we pick up in verse 32. And this is where David is before Saul. Where would you end the scene of David and Saul interacting? 39. I think 39 is one place we can put it. I think we could add 40 into it as well. But yeah, so 40 ends up coming out of 39, but right there is the perfect point there. Saul and David. All right. Then we have verse 41. And then what would you take verse 41 to, this next scene?
About 51 when he killed him.
Okay. We can do 51. I would go to 47 first.
I was gonna say, could you argue that, because that's the direct interaction between David and Goliath.
Yep.
And it changes after he kills
Yep.
Yeah.
So you have the conversation of David and Goliath. And then in verse 48, we then move on. And then where would you take verse 48 to? I think 51 would be a good place to do it. The actual fight, 48 to 51. And then 52. And I think you can go 52 all the way to 58 of the celebration of David as conqueror. All right. So, these are our scenes. This is about as many scenes as would be in a normal episode of a TV show. You have the introduction, and then really, if you want to think of it in TV language, after this you'd have the theme song. And then out of that, you go over to David. He's out in the field, and he goes and he talks to Jesse, and Jesse says, "Hey, go take some cheese sandwiches to your sons, to my sons, to your brothers." David goes out and he brings the food, and then David's there, and he hears someone spouting off about God. He's like, "What is this guy doing?" And he's talking, and then David starts going, "No one should be doing that." And then you have this pull aside. Eliab, how dare you? You think you're big? You think you're strong? You're not. David doesn't care. And then you have it to where David's then presented to Saul, and you have this interaction of Saul and David. And it can't be, it's not working that way. And then from there, you then have David finally, towards the end of the episode, he finally then confronts Goliath. And they're talking, and they're chatting back and forth. And then from there, then you have the fight. The build-up, what was started in verse 1, you have the fight. And then out of the fight, you then have the celebration. And that celebration is going to build up to something in the next episode of chapter 18. And our goal then of the scene structure is we want to do exactly what we just did there. Be able to just retell it a little bit. And then what we can do, what time do I have?
6:01.
Okay, then. I'm not that late. Then I have a little bit of time to go over. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read the story, but I'm going to do it in a dramatic way to where you can feel it more as a story and less of a reading. And I want you to notice the things that we identified. Notice the characters that we've identified. Notice the scene structure we've identified, and start seeing all of that come together as the story. So, starting in verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered together at Sokoah, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Sokoah and Azekah in Ephah-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle arrays against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze greaves on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to him, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of that Ephraite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, who had 8 sons, and the man was old, advanced in years in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem, and the Philistines drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Then Jesse said to his son David, Take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their thousands, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things which as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle, for Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and he give his father's house exemption in Israel. And then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should divide the armies of the living God? The people answered in this manner, saying, So shall it be done for the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, What have I done now? Is there not a cause? Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. And when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine. And Saul said to David, You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, Your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And from it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, Go, and the Lord be with you. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. And David fastened his sword to his armor, and he tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Then he took his staff in hand, and he chose for him 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, and a pouch which he had. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistines cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin? But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." And so it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew nearer to meet David, that David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David pulled his hand into his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley into the gate of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road of Sharaim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistines and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his army in his tent. Now Saul saw David going out against the Philistines. He said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." The king said, "Inquire whose son this young man is." Then as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." The story came alive after you saw all the characters. And that's what we're going to go through. And what you do when you're studying narrative is after you figure out that scene structure, after you figure out these main things of who these characters are, understand the background, you can find that voice of what it sounds like. Then you can start going through and figuring out some other things. You can start asking questions like, why does Goliath have an armor bearer? Might be because he was the king of the Philistines. You start asking questions, why didn't Saul go out to fight him? Why is Saul back there? And you start seeing all these other details start coming to life. And as you go through and you're feeling this story, it's kind of like watching your favorite movie or TV show. The first time you watch through it, you notice some stuff. Then you start noticing more and more and more with each watch. And all of a sudden you're noticing every little detail of that story, and you can practically retell the story in your own words from heart. And that's how you find the answer of what happened in a narrative. That's what we're looking for. We just want to understand that. We want to understand that there's certain things that David said about God. We want to understand specifically those things, but we want to understand it in the context of the story of what he said. David telling off the Goliath, this Philistine, about who God is, matters in the context of the story. We can get to this idea of God doesn't need sword or shield to win a battle, or a sword or spear to win a battle. We can get that, but we understand that from the full context of the story. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. Any questions? Concerns, fears, woes, worries? Here's what I'd encourage you most. Whenever you're reading story, learn to be a good storyteller. Have you guys read to children's books? Raise your hand if you've done that before. Okay. What do kids like more? When you just read it flat? They like it when you put the energy into it. Your first read through, as we did, is hard to be able to put that emphasis into it. You don't necessarily know where it is. You're reading through it the first time and you don't really know exactly where it is. You might have to read through a few times to be able to get to it, but you want to eventually get to that place where you can read it and you can just paint this picture in your mind. You can enjoy that story because Scripture is rich. 70% of this book is story. And it's the greatest story ever told. It should not be boring to us. And so our goal in studying story is to get to a place where we see what's happening, where it's not boring to us. We're seeing the detail. We're understanding what's going on. All right. Any other thoughts, questions? All right, let me close this in prayer. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for the stories of Scripture, that they are true, that they're inerrant, they're infallible, they're historically accurate, but they're also for our good. Lord, let us be reminded as we're trying to just understand what happened in the story. Let us be reminded that eventually we will move towards the next step, that everything that happened in this book happens so we can know now how we ought to live. Lord, I pray that you would help us, open our eyes, let us put in the hard work of study. We love you, Lord, in your Son's holy and precious name. Amen.